Robert Howard Jackson was very much of this place. He was born and as a young boy raised on the family farm in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania. He was schooled as a young boy in Frewsburg. He lived and worked for 20 years as a young man here in Jamestown, and then, of course, moved to the national and international stage. He was a descendant on his father's side of course, the Jacksons and also the Eldreds, and on his mother's side, from the Howitts and the Gregorys. And these people were incredibly hardworking and very smart farmers, by and large. They were not religious in an organized membership sense, but they were people of freedom. They were people of morality. They were people of values. And it was in that tradition that their boy Robert was raised. He was of this place, literally of this place, a member of St. Luke's Church. Yet he was a thinker more than what one might call a traditional believer. The ideas in every realm were important to Robert Jackson, the secular, the legal, and the religious. And as you'll hear in a few moments, he worked hard, I think, intellectually on his faith. As so many regular acts can be, our lives are filled with prayer, and a big part of Robert Jackson's life was the regular act of writing. Robert Jackson was a man of thought and mind, and his pen was a powerful tool. His writing skills were beautiful. And in a moment, I will read you some words that he wrote about faith. He was, as you know, as we remember this morning, a believer in freedom. His work at Nuremberg was about that. And in his words about faith, you will hear an echo and a direct connection to his theory, his purpose, the supreme crime that was prosecuted at Nuremberg, the crime of waging aggressive war. In his mind and in his writing, it connected to his faith views. And in Robert Jackson, I think we see a morality, a divinity, and the hand of a supreme being. He wrote in the last year of his life on a yellow pad, like so many of his first drafts, what probably was a section for an autobiography that he intended to draft. This segment from which I'll read was called "The Faith of My Fathers." I cannot remember any effort by either of my parents or any of my grandparents to instill in me any religious doctrine. There were several Bibles in the house, including some gruesomely illustrated. There were a few books on religious subjects. Afar back, the Jacksons, like many of the Scotch-Irish stock, had been Presbyterians, and the early days in the wilderness may have been colored by the gloomy teachings of Knox and Calvin. The Eldreds originally were of the Church of England school, but neither Presbyterians nor Episcopalians were strong in the regions where we lived, and none of my family in my days at home were affiliated with any formal religious group. None of them was intellectually or emotionally committed to any particular denomination or dogma. I cannot recall that I was ever sent or urged to go to Sunday school. But along with those of my age, I attended the Baptist Sunday School in Frewsburg, namely because its teachers included some I admired, and so did its choir. But I was reared in an atmosphere of perfect respect for the religious views of others, or at least the respect for the personal right to have any religion one preferred. While of little formal faith ourselves, I never knew any of them to try to arouse doubts in the minds of another or to unsettle his faith. On the contrary, as a mere youngster, I was soundly spanked for denouncing Catholicism to an Irish hired girl, although Mother knew I was only repeating what I had heard a violent anti-Catholic say. And in early high school days, when my father heard that I, with several others, had visited a revival meeting and behaved irreverently to the annoyance of the congregation, I received a reprimand couched in unforgettable, irreligious language. They let others alone in their beliefs and practices and were reasonably tolerant of their missionary efforts, if not much moved by them. Typical of this attitude is an incident I recall when a fiery United Brethren minister called. Only my grandfather Jackson and my baby sister Helen and I, in early high school, were home. After a few neighborly remarks, the preacher asked if he could pray for my grandfather's soul. "Why, I don't mind if you want to," said the old man. but do it quietly so you will not awaken the baby. But their attitude toward organized religions did not mean that they had no reflective hours on the problems of life and death. Indeed, in the stillness of the country evening, they often meditated on whence we came and whither we go and why we are here. They never got very far with the answers, a matter in which there is little to distinguish them between the efforts of the simplest and the greatest of minds. But at least they knew a mystery when they saw one and did not pretend to get answers out of the clouds, and they acknowledged no better authority on the subject for themselves than their own reason and effort. No dogma was invoked to prevent discussion, nor to provide answers where reason failed to give any, and there was no trace of atheism in any of them. A vague belief in some hazy kind of supreme being hovered over their serious moments. The male Jacksons were traditionally active Freemasons in a small country lodge where masonry is at its best. That is based on a belief in a supreme being and goes little beyond. That perhaps was nearest to a formulated religious belief that any of them possessed. Death, they simply took as in the natural order of things. I cannot recall a single manifestation of fear of it in any of them. Who ordained it, what it meant in terms of the personality, and what, if anything, lies beyond, they knew not. But to it they would go alone, yet with all mankind for company. And they expected to get through it as well as most. I should sum up the attitudes that I absorbed from the example more than from the precept of my forebears by saying that religion is an intensely personal affair in which one is entitled to be free from aggression. From the beginning, I was taught that the other man's relations with the infinite were none of my business. My people detested all meddlesomeness in the affairs of the Spirit, and so do I. How well I have walked in this faith, or non-faith as you may choose to call it, is for others to judge. I never joined any formal religious organization until I was well along in years. My wife was an Episcopalian, and our children were sent to its, meaning St. Luke's, Sunday school. When my son was about to be confirmed, he raised the question why he should be if I had not. It was easier to be confirmed than to answer the question. But it was a little more than that. The confirming bishop was Right Reverend Walter Overs, a lifelong dear friend of mine and my family. He had officiated at my father's funeral in Frewsburg, and as a former Methodist himself, belonged to the more liberal school of that church. And so if its teachings were not entirely intellectually satisfying, its general attitudes towards life came nearer to my own than any other, though I cannot profess to have been other than negligent, even of its most comfortable ordinances. I have had many, many advantages over my parents and grandparents and those who shared their lives. I have met priests, archbishops, and the Pope. I have heard great preachers in my country, in England, and in Europe. Rather more than casually, I have dipped into the holy writ of other peoples, the best available translation of the glorious Quran of the Muslim world, that immutable symphony, the very sound of which moves men to tears and ecstasy, the sayings of Confucius, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Bhagavad Gita of the Hindu, the Book of Mormon, and many, many Christian works. I have journeyed to Jerusalem, and on a Christmas even to Bethlehem. We're walking outside the little village. The shepherds were still tending their flocks, and the stars seemed almost within reach. And I have lingered for days at Luxor, resting in the shade cast by temples that the faith of men built 4,000 years ago, and trudging through a city of tombs that bespoke their belief that death was a beginning as well as an end. I cannot add one thought to those I heard expressed by simple country folks around the fireside when death had struck in their midst and they were pensive and sad. Amen.